unos 2 o 3 temas más, pero bueno, ya igual son cosas que igual las van a ir viendo a medida que sigan en la carrera, la van a tener en medicina interna, mantengan sus otras rotaciones ya en los hospitales. Así que, pero bueno, al menos, por lo menos yo creo que he dado lo suficiente para que queden con ciertas bases y pueden estar lo suficientemente orientados cuando ya les toque ya estar ya con pacientes de este tipo, ¿no? Les he dicho que íbamos a tal vez hacer repaso, vamos a ayudar de videos y todo. Como les dije, la UES tiene un convenio con el Estudio. Creo que no sé a todos, pero a algunos maestros de acá de la UES nos han dado acceso al Estudio y también a algunos alumnos también se lo han dado, con el objetivo de que en un futuro todos tengan acceso al Estudio. ¿Okay? Así que yo ya con mis alumnos de fármaco he estado utilizando el Estudio para dar algunas clases y la verdad que bien, está muy bueno para estudiar y repasar con esta plataforma. Así que bueno, aprovechémosla para ahora hacer el repaso de lo que hemos visto, ¿no? Y listo. Cualquier pregunta, me la hacen. Así que bueno. Sí, para variar también internet acá. ¿Perdón?
Lima dice que pase la clave. Sí, yo sí tengo que
Now, there are a number of...
La clase de Pornhub
of compensatory...
Me acabó el chiste, no. Ok. Como el primer tema que vimos fue insuficiencia cardíaca, ¿verdad? Repasemos insuficiencia cardíaca.
Now, there are a number of compensatory mechanisms that the body sets off when it sees heart failure. Remember, I mentioned them just a few moments ago. What are the compensatory mechanisms?
Vamos al primer video. Está a hacer el segundo. Ahora sí.
In this series, we are going to consider one of the most serious problems that faces a cardiologist, the patient with heart failure. Heart failure is very common and increasingly common these days. It's because it is a common complication of older individuals, and of course, the older population is increasing throughout North America and Western Europe, as well as Asia. Heart failure is defined differently in different circumstances by different cardiologists, but basically it's an inability of the heart to pump enough blood to meet the demands of the body. In other words, if one exercises, one requires an increase in blood flow to the body, and if you can't do that, you may develop the symptoms of heart failure. As we're going to see, there are a number of compensatory mechanisms that get set off in heart failure, and some of them actually work to increase symptoms in these patients. The major issue here is that the heart has an inadequate or decreased cardiac output. Remember, cardiac output, that's stroke volume times heart rate. That is the amount of blood the heart puts out each beat times the heart rate. And in this setting, what you see is that the patient has an increase in blood volume because of compensatory mechanisms that work to correct the heart failure state. Unfortunately, this leads to fluid accumulation in the body and even edema, that is swelling in the body. This can also be associated with circulatory congestion, for example, in the lungs. So you have increased fluid in the lungs, so the patients are short of breath. And in addition, you may see patients being markedly fatigued because they're not getting adequate heart pumping. As I said before, it's a very common problem. There are more than 3 million patients in the United States with heart failure. There's a number of new patients presenting every year. and unfortunately, heart failure has a very poor prognosis, often a prognosis just as bad as many forms of cancer. Heart failure is more common in African Americans, and it's interesting that these patients seem to do better briefly when they're admitted to the hospital, but their long-term outlook is worse. Some of this may be because of lower socioeconomic conditions in many African Americans. The heart failure frequency in the U.S. has been increasing with an increasing population. A statistic I like to quote is that in the United States, in every 24-hour period, more people will become age 85 than will be born. So you can imagine if heart failure is a very common problem in the elderly, just as atrial fibrillation is a common problem in the elderly, both of these are what I call, quote, growth industries. And again, women tend to be a little less frequently affected by heart failure. Men is a little more common early on, but once we get into the geriatric population, above 65 to 70, the amount is about the same. There are a number of factors that are referred to when we talk about heart failure, and you'll remember some of these factors from the basic lectures on heart function. Remember preload. Preload is filling of the heart, so that it's a manifestation of the size of the ventricle when it fills up. When you have increased blood volume, you increase the preload, that is, the amount of volume that the heart has to squeeze out. This happens with some of the compensatory mechanisms that increase the blood volume, and consequently, preload may be increased in the heart, and what increased preload leads to is increased filling pressures in the ventricle during diastole, during the rest period. This leads to increased pressures in the ventricle during diastole, and those increased pressures are transmitted back to the lungs and even back to the rest of the body, leading to fluid accumulation in the tissues of the lung and the rest of the body. Afterload is the work of the heart. It's the resistance the ventricle feels when it is pumping out. This is usually due to resistance in the vascular system. You'll remember that from the basic lecture in cardiology. Increased peripheral vascular resistance leads to increased afterload, increased work of the heart. You can imagine that's not good in heart failure. And in fact, here's a clue. When we talk about therapy of heart failure, one of the things is to decrease afterload, to decrease the work of the ventricle and hope that it will recover from its depressed state. There are two forms of heart failure, systolic and diastolic. In other words, sometimes, let's take diastolic first, the ventricle squeezes all right, but it fails to relax normally. It relaxes slowly or in a stiffened manner, leading to increased pressure in there that gets transmitted throughout the circulation and leads to collection of fluid, as we talked about before, edema. Systolic heart failure is when the ventricle fails to squeeze well. That can happen, of course, with a patient who's had a heart attack, happens to patients with cardiomyopathy, heart muscle disease, and often systolic heart failure is associated also with diastolic. So most patients with heart failure have both systolic and diastolic, but there is a whole group of patients, a minority as you can see from the circle diagram here, who have pure diastolic heart failure. Interestingly, the long-term prognosis for diastolic heart failure is just as bad as for systolic heart failure. Diastolic heart failure tends to occur in older individuals, often with thickened heart muscle.
Aquí viene lo bueno del estudio. Cada videíto se acompaña de preguntas de control, ¿no? De control de video, no de lectura, ¿no? Así que bueno, entonces, ¿qué es lo importante de rescatar en cuanto a estas definiciones que pasaron en el video, ¿no? Voy a hacer un poco de zoom para que puedan ver lo que está más atrás. ¿Cuál de las siguientes se refiere al estiramiento pasivo de la fibra del músculo cardíaco antes de la contracción? Resistencia vascular sistémica, postcarga, volumen sistólico, precarga o inotropía cardíaca. A ver, no digo nadie, no escucho a nadie que me hable con seguridad. Precarga, dice Lima. ¿Hay alguien que está de acuerdo con Lima o no está de acuerdo? ¿Ah? ¿Es resistencia vascular sistémica? ¿Es la primera resistencia vascular sistémica? No, ¿no? ¿Poscarga? No tiene nada que ver. ¿Por qué? Porque la poscarga, ¿qué es? Está bien. Volumen sistólico. Estamos todos de acuerdo que precarga, ¿verdad? Le podemos hacerlo con carita feliz, que estamos totalmente seguros, ¿verdad? ¿Seguro? Ojo, contestan ustedes, no yo, ¿ah? Yo pongo lo que digan ustedes. Porque precarga, ¿verdad?
¿Qué tan seguro está con carita feliz?
Correcto, muy bien. ¿Perdón? ¿Qué pasó? ¿Me caí? ¿Ah? Voy a jugar como loquita, Vizcaíno también. Veo que se contagia algo por aquí. Después se van a jugar a la espadita. Ya. A ver, ¿cuál de las siguientes afirmaciones representa la precarga con mayor precisión? La distensibilidad del ventrículo no puede afectar la precarga. La precarga es una fuerza que se opone o estira al músculo cardíaco después de la contracción. Aumento del volumen de sangre reduce la precarga. El aumento de la precarga disminuye la presión de llenado del ventrículo. La precarga es el estiramiento pasivo del ventrículo antes de la contracción. Yo pienso que sí, también ustedes. ¿Cuál de los siguientes términos describe con mayor precisión la insuficiencia cardíaca diastólica? Insuficiencia cardíaca con fracción de eyección del ventrículo izquierdo conservada, insuficiencia cardíaca con fracción de eyección del ventrículo izquierdo variada, insuficiencia cardíaca con aumento de la fracción de eyección del ventrículo izquierdo, insuficiencia cardíaca con fracción de eyección del ventrículo izquierdo reducida. Estábamos hablando de que insuficiencia cardíaca diastólica. ¿Seguro, Lima? Pero no se acuerdan que también, aquí yo a todos los pongo a dudar. O sea, no está del todo mal. O sea, sí, es verdad, puede estar preservada. Podría estar aumentada la presión de eyección. Sí. Si tengo más músculo miocárdico porque está engrosado, entonces va a contraer con más fuerza. O sea, aquí vienen las dudas, que inclusive hasta un médico puede también entrar en dudas. ¿Por qué? Porque una insuficiencia cardíaca diastólica, que se asume que es porque está hipertrofiado ese miocardio, en muchos lugares, en muchos libros, está descrito que la fracción de eyección puede estar preservada o aumentada. Entonces, ¿qué hago? ¿En la una o en la otra? Pero la cosa es que variada, no sé si por ese variado quiere decir en ese variado entre reducida, porque reducida no debería de estar la fracción de eyección. Eso sí, reducida no debería estar, porque reducida es equivalente a la fracción de la sistólica. Entonces, ¿conservada o aumentada?
Mantengo mi elección.
Bueno, por mayoría me parece que están diciendo que es la 1, ¿verdad?
Sí.
¿Qué carita le ponemos?
Sí.
Están seguritos, están segurísimos entonces. Muy bien. En tus sueños.
Una preguntita ahí por eso.
Now, there are a number of compensatory mechanisms that the body sets off when it sees heart failure. Remember, I mentioned them just a few moments ago. What are the compensatory mechanisms? Well, let's think. Why would the body compensate for decreased cardiac output, for decreased pumping of the blood? The reason the body compensates is because it interprets heart failure as if there had been a hemorrhage, a blood loss, or dehydration. In other words, the reduced pumping ability, the body interprets as, oh, there's a lack of blood from a hemorrhage, or there's a lack of fluid in the circulation because of dehydration. And it sets off a whole bunch of compensatory mechanisms aimed at holding on to fluid, water, and salt. Unfortunately, this is exactly the opposite of what we would want, because in holding on to fluid, you actually create the setting where patients put some of that fluid into the tissues, both in the legs as edema or in the lung as pulmonary edema. So the activation of the neurohumoral system, that is central nervous system initiated activity to correct the heart failure situation actually makes the situation worse. These systems work great if there's dehydration, you're caught in the desert without water. They work great if there's a hemorrhage, you've been cut somewhere, or you're bleeding from an ulcer in your stomach. But they work, unfortunately, in a negative manner in the patient with heart failure. Let's just talk for a moment about why these compensatory mechanisms work. They work because of something I mentioned before, Starling's law, the so-called rubber band law of the heart. The more you fill it, the more it contracts. So what the compensatory mechanisms are trying to do is to increase the filling of the heart so it will squeeze more. As I've said, unfortunately, that leads to elevated pressures that back up in the system and result in edema. But the rubber band law of the heart says that the force of contraction is related to how much you stretch the heart muscle cells, and this increases contractility. So you see why the body is trying to increase the pumping ability of the heart, and this works fine if it's a hemorrhage or dehydration, but it doesn't work well when the patient has heart failure. So remember, stroke volume is the number of cubic centimeters that the heart puts out with each time it squeezes, times heart rate, that's cardiac output. So when we have a reduction in stroke volume because the heart has been injured, sometimes you'll even see the heart rate go up because the central nervous system says, oh, cardiac output is falling, we have to increase the heart rate. We have to increase our ability to hold on to salt and water and increase the blood volume and use the Starling law to increase the contractility of the heart. Again, unfortunately, it's not the right setting for that, and this leads to overfilling of the circulation, increased pressures in the circulation, and increased fluid getting out into the lungs and into the tissues. So the central factor in heart failure, of course, is depression of the heart muscle, at least for systolic heart failure. But also in diastolic heart failure, the heart is supposed to actively relax, and there's also depression of that. But the commonest form of heart failure, as you've seen in the previous slide, was systolic, and it is usually because there's been some injury to the heart muscle, most commonly from ischemic or coronary artery disease with heart attacks. And again, we've talked about the compensatory mechanisms. Here are the compensatory mechanisms listed. First of all, they're initiated by the central nervous system. One of them is a signal that's sent to the kidneys and that the kidney actually does on its own. The kidney is the regulator of the blood pressure in the body. It sees a drop in blood pressure, a drop in cardiac output, and it releases compounds in something called the renin-angiotensin system, which holds on to salt and water. It's hormones that actively tell the kidney, hey, don't pee out sodium and water. Hold on to it because the circulatory system needs some volume. There are also hormones that are released from the pituitary, so-called antidiuretic hormone, which tells the kidney, hey, hold on to water. Don't let the water go out in the urine. In addition, you also will have activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the flight or fight system. This sends adrenaline to the heart muscle to try and get it to contract more vigorously, and it also clamps down a little bit on the periphery in an attempt to shrink the volume that the heart has to pump into. All of these compensatory mechanisms, you can see, they work great if we're talking about dehydration or hemorrhage, but they work in the wrong direction when the patient already has a depressed left ventricle. The other thing that happens is that the heart muscle remodels. It reconstructs itself, if you will. You can see in this diagram on the left, there's one form of remodeling, left ventricular hypertrophy, where the ventricle markedly thickens, for example, with aortic stenosis, as we talked about with the patient in the last lecture. On the other side is the sort of thing you see in a cardiomyopathy. The heart dilates, thickens a little bit, but predominantly what it does is it dilates. And you've all heard someone say, oh, so-and-so's in trouble. They have a, quote, big heart. That's because the heart's dilated. That's often the final stage of heart failure, when the heart has exhausted all of its other compensatory mechanisms to get the cardiac output up. Then you start to see this dilatation of the left ventricle.
¿Qué puedo concluir con todo esto? O sea, ¿dónde está entonces la piedra angular del problema en la insuficiencia cardíaca? O sea, a ver, lo que quiero decir, la piedra angular del problema es los mecanismos de compensación. Realmente no compensan. En el caso de insuficiencia cardíaca descompensan, porque son mecanismos de compensación, no de insuficiencia cardíaca, son mecanismos de compensación para deshidratación o para hemorragia. O sea, el cuerpo no dice, estoy infartado, mi ventrículo no está pudiendo inyectar lo suficiente a fluir de sangre y no está perfundiendo. Simplemente el cuerpo de uno lo siente como que no estoy perfundiendo riñones, he de estar deshidratado o he de estar desangrando, no tengo suficiente volumen, vamos a aumentar el volumen, ¿verdad? Y se activa todos los mecanismos neurohormonales como tremina, angiotensina, aldosterona, a la vez también, como va a bajar la presión arterial, voy a tener menor estimulación de los vasoreceptores a nivel de las carótidas y de los demás, callado de la aorta, lo cual también le va a mandar una señal al sistema nervioso central pidiendo que pise el acelerador, o sea, activando el sistema nervioso simpático, ¿verdad? Provocando eso, que haya más adrenalina, y eso obviamente va a ocasionar que se estimulen los receptores de beta 1 en el corazón. ¿Qué le va a hacer al corazón? Beta 1 estimulado por epinefrina en el corazón, ¿qué hace el corazón? Aumenta el inotropismo y aumenta el cronotropismo, ¿verdad? ¿Okay? Eso no quiero. También, si estimulo beta 1 a nivel del aparato intracelular, ¿qué pasa? ¿Qué hace el aparato intracelular al tener receptores beta 1 estimulados con una liberación de catecolaminas? ¿Ah? ¡Qué bestia! Debería ir a trabajar en la NASA. Bien, muy bien, ¿eh? Claro, beta beta 1, el estimular beta 1 libera renina, lo cual entonces, aparte de la respuesta directa por simpática, también está provocando también que el riñón ya de por sí ya empezó a activar el sistema renina-angiotensina-aldosterona, ¿verdad? Ya, de ahí la respuesta simpática va a ser que también libere todavía más renina todavía. Entonces es peor todavía. ¿Okay? Entonces, por eso que digo que es la piedra angular, porque para poder tratar a un paciente y mejorarlo, tengo que ir a interrumpir todo eso, a interrumpir todo ese ciclo vicioso. ¿Okay? Y por eso usamos entonces diuréticos, usamos inhibidores de la enzima convertidora de la angiotensina o bloqueantes de receptores de angiotensina, ¿okay? Beta bloqueantes. ¿Para qué? ¿Para qué beta bloqueantes? ¿Ah? Para contrarrestar pues, la respuesta simpática, pues, ¿no? ¿Ya? Pero ojo, beta bloqueante en el paciente de insuficiencia cardíaca lo uso en qué estadio de la insuficiencia cardíaca. Ojo, que es una pregunta de examen. ¿En qué etapa? ¿En el paciente que me llegó agudo, ahogándose, o que ya está estabilizado y lo mando a la casa? ¿Ah? Ya estabilizado, empiezo el beta bloqueante. Sería una iatrogenia, darle beta bloqueante en el paciente que ingresa con edema agudo de pulmón, ¿ok? Porque se lo va a empeorar, ¿ok? Entonces, ¿cuál de los siguientes compuestos químicos aumenta la frecuencia cardíaca? Acetilcolina, epinefrina, bradicinina, quinógeno, fragmento de quininógeno. Creo que es bastante obvio, ¿no? Epinefrina, creo que hasta alguien del colegio puede contestar esta pregunta. Ok, en insuficiencia cardíaca, ¿cómo intentan los riñones compensar la disminución de la capacidad del corazón para bombear sangre? Liberar hormonas antidiuréticas, disminuir la reabsorción de sodio en grasa de engendro, aumenta la contractilidad del miocardio, libera epinefrina o aumenta la retención de líquido de sangre. ¿Por qué? ¿Qué hormona se encarga de eso específicamente? La aldosterona. Muy bien. Según la ley de Starling, ¿qué efecto tiene el aumento del volumen diastólico final en un corazón sano? Aumento de la congestión pulmonar, disminución de la perfusión de órganos terminales, aumento de la cronotropía miocárdica, aumento del volumen sistólico o disminución del volumen sistólico. ¿Estamos de acuerdo que mayor volumen sistólico? ¿Carita feliz? Sí.
Now, again, we talked about the different kinds of heart failure, systolic and diastolic, but sometimes there are definitions based upon.
¿Les está aburriendo esto? ¿Seguro? ¿Está bien? Si no les gusta, los palos, ¿ah?
On which ventricle is in the most trouble. Most common is left-sided heart failure. That's because the left ventricle has been injured. But in some conditions, such as severe lung disease with high pressures in the lungs, you may just see isolated right-sided heart failure. So let's think about this for a moment. With left-sided heart failure, the backup is going to be into the lungs. Patients get fluid in the lungs and they're short of breath. So the edema is in the lungs with left-sided heart failure. With right-sided heart failure, the backup is into the veins, so you often see patients with fluid in the abdomen, fluid in the legs, so-called peripheral edema. And the left ventricle may be working just fine, but it's not getting any blood from the right ventricle because the right ventricle is failing. And of course, it's obvious what the left ventricle puts out depends on what the right ventricle puts out. If they have to balance out. If they don't balance out, all the blood is going to end up on one side of the circulation or the other. And then we've talked about before, systolic heart failure, failure of contraction, diastolic heart failure, failure of relaxation.
Patients with chronic heart failure can be divided into two broad categories based on whether their ejection fraction is normal or reduced. These two categories are heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, called HFpEF, and heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, called HFrEF. Sometimes a third category is implied and used, and that's heart failure with mildly reduced ejection fraction of 41 to 49%, because normal, of course, is above 50%. For the most part, it's important to know the differences between the two distinct types of heart failure. About half of the patients with heart failure have HFpEF, and about half have HFrEF. This distinction has prognostic value, and it also helps guide therapy for the patients with heart failure, since therapy is different for HFpEF and HFrEF. HFpEF is defined as a left ventricular ejection fraction of 50% or more in a patient with signs and symptoms of clinical heart failure. Although most patients with HFpEF have diastolic dysfunction with elevated filling pressures, asymptomatic diastolic dysfunction can be seen with normal aging in individuals who do not have clinical symptoms. So, although people with diastolic dysfunction have a risk factor for HFpEF, these two terms are not synonymous. HFpEF must be distinguished from other causes of heart failure in patients with an ejection fraction greater than 50%. And these include patients with valvular heart disease, pericardial disease, cardiac amyloidosis, and high output heart failure, such as that seen with severe anemia or hyperthyroidism. Heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, or HFrEF, is defined as a left ventricular ejection fraction less than 50%, although an ejection fraction in the 40s is sometimes called mildly reduced ejection fraction. Patients with HFrEF have difficulty with the pumping function of the left ventricle, the heart, and by definition, a reduced ejection fraction in the left ventricle, known as impaired systolic function. Decreased ejection fraction leads to inadequate tissue perfusion and, of course, influences the prognosis of the patient. As you might expect, the lower the ejection fraction, often the worse the patient does and the more symptoms they have. Cardiac remodeling is a response to hemodynamic load as well as neurohormonal activation. Pathological remodeling can be seen with pressure overload due to hypertension or aortic stenosis. It can also be seen with volume overload with valvular regurgitation or with cardiac injury, for example, myocardial infarction. The management of HFrEF is quite different from the management of HFpEF, and it's important to know the differences.
Here's just a little diagram to remind you how the whole body is a coordinated system. You see the brain is connected to the heart, the brain is connected to the kidneys, they're all connected to the peripheral blood vessels, and as we've talked about, when there's heart failure or when there's dehydration or when there's hemorrhage, all of these factors become activated in an attempt to A, restore the blood volume, and B, restore the pumping ability of the heart. And here they are, all listed again, just as we talked about before. The central nervous system is critical, sympathetic nervous system is activated, the kidney through the renin-angiotensin system is activated, and the ventricle gets increased volume and therefore uses the Starling mechanism. All of these things work together. They work great if the patient's blood volume is down because of dehydration and hemorrhage. They work against you when the problem is that the heart is not pumping enough. And again, here you see a diagram that just shows you how all of these interact, how decreased cardiac output can lead to lung congestion, and how increased peripheral pressure can lead to peripheral edema, the neurohormonal activations through the kidney that go on. All of these things are working in a complete circus motion, like a horse riding around the track in a circus, around and around, they keep reinforcing each other, and unfortunately, in heart failure, lead to marked retention of water and salt that leads to the various symptoms that the heart failure patient has. The American Heart Association guidelines talk about various levels of heart failure. Level A is somebody who's really predisposed to heart failure but has not developed it yet. So that's somebody with high blood pressure, diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, hyperlipidemia, as we've talked about, that leads to atherosclerosis. Heart failure hasn't developed yet, but the substrate, if you will, is ready to go on and cause a heart condition that will lead to heart failure. Grade B is when you're starting to have some very early signs of heart failure by some of our fancy tests, such as from the echocardiogram, but the patient is still asymptomatic. Stage C is when the patient is already having symptoms. They're tired, they're short of breath, they have peripheral edema, and stage D is when they're really incapacitated with heart failure, marked severe symptoms of heart failure.
Eso lo hablamos en clase, ¿se acuerdan, no? No se acuerdan. Entonces, sí, también se dice que aquellos con insuficiencia cardíaca y fracción de eyección reducida, o sea, se benefician más del uso de betabloqueantes que el de fracción de eyección preservada. ¿Okay? O sea, lo que quiero decir, si la insuficiencia cardíaca es con fracción de eyección reducida, no hay vuelta que darle. Sí o sí tiene que ese paciente estar con un beta bloqueante. Sí o sí. ¿Okay? Si tiene una fracción de eyección preservada, sí y no. ¿Okay? Se lo puedes dar, le puede mejorar los síntomas, lo puede ayudar. No está demostrado científicamente que en ese paciente le va a reducir tanto la mortalidad como se la reduce al que sí tiene fracción de eyección reducida. Por eso es que inclusive, si yo tengo un paciente con insuficiencia cardíaca de fracción de eyección preservada, y por ahí digo, mira, le pongo un beta bloqueante, pero mira, tiene una frecuencia cardíaca ya de 60, 57, no sé, me da miedo que si le doy un beta bloqueante le vaya a bajar más la frecuencia cardíaca. Entonces, pero como es de frecuencia preservada, realmente no estoy recontra que obligado a tener que dar el beta bloqueante, entonces lo podemos, por ahora lo podemos omitir y lo vamos viendo. Pero si es fracción de eyección reducida, es indicación de tener que manejarlo con beta bloqueantes en el paciente ya que está estabilizado, siempre, ¿no? ¿Cuál de los siguientes es más probable que causa edema periférico? Enfermedad pulmonar intersticial, insuficiencia cardíaca con fracción de eyección conservada, insuficiencia cardíaca inducida por isquemia, insuficiencia cardíaca con fracción de eyección reducida, insuficiencia cardíaca del lado derecho. ¿Tú estás de acuerdo? ¿Seguro? ¿Estás de acuerdo? Ni le dije. Estamos entonces en la última, ¿estamos de acuerdo todos? Si llegase a ver uno que piensa distinto, y dices, no doctor, yo pienso que Lima es un puentero y no es lo de Lima, yo digo que es esta, a esa persona sí se le puede considerar punto adicional. ¿Nos vamos entonces por insuficiencia cardíaca del lado derecho? ¿Sí o no? Igual no queda en Lima. A ver, causa y síntomas ahora.
Now, it's important to remember that heart failure relates to atherosclerosis in the majority of cases who present to the cardiologist with heart failure. No surprise. Remember, we talked about the last time I spoke to you about the typical patient. That's the commonest patient that comes to the cardiologist, the patient with atherosclerotic heart disease. When that disease is advanced, particularly if the patient has had previous myocardial infarcts or heart attacks, the ventricular function is compromised and the patient shows up with heart failure. So what are the risk factors for heart failure? They're the risk factors for atherosclerotic heart disease. They're hypercholesterolemia, hypertension, cigarette smoking, diabetes, all the things we talked about before that can lead to atherosclerosis. And you can see that the commonest ones, are problems leading to heart failure is ischemic heart disease, but there's a number of other factors that are involved as well. But ischemic heart disease, the number one cause of death in the world, number one cause of heart failure. There are a number of rarer causes of heart failure. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but for example, in the United States, one of the commonest causes of cardiomyopathy is excessive alcohol intake. Alcohol is a poison for the myocardium. Taken in small amounts, it's good, it increases the HDL level, can be very pleasant in a social setting, but excessive alcohol can lead to cardiomyopathy, and of course a lot of other problems, liver failure, cirrhosis, etc., etc. There are other things that can cause heart failure. We've talked about this before, cardiomyopathy from a chronic viral infection, certain...
¿Qué tipo de insuficiencia cardíaca provocaría la intoxicación por alcohol? O sea, alguien que ha hecho insuficiencia cardíaca porque es un alcohólico. No me estoy refiriendo si es derecha o izquierda. ¿Qué tipo de insuficiencia cardíaca? O sea, hace una dilatada, hipertrófica. Está asociado a miocardiopatía dilatada. ¿Okay? Como se trata de una miocardiopatía por el abuso de alcohol, suele ser dilatada, hipertrófica, dilatada. O sea, el alcohol se dice que es tóxico para el miocardio, lo daña. ¿Okay? Lo daña y ese miocardio se va atrofiando. Entonces se dilata el corazón. ¿Okay? ¿Perdón? También está relacionado a la microcardiopatía asociada a HIV. Bueno,
Drugs can do it.
Cocaína, obviamente, si me hace liberar mayor norepinefrina, o sea, le estoy aumentando también mayor demanda de oxígeno al corazón. Y si es alguien que consume repetidamente sustancias como la cocaína, y eso va a provocar que primero haga una hipertrofia ventricular, ¿okay? Que eventualmente va a llegar a tener una insuficiencia cardíaca, en un infarto del miocardio, que también ya saben que la cardiopatía isquémica es la principal causa de insuficiencia cardíaca, ¿verdad?
One of the favorite drugs for chemotherapy for breast cancer also damages the heart, and other drugs can do the same thing. And of course, arrhythmias with long-standing fast heart rate that's uncontrolled can also lead to cardiac fatigue. These things are much rarer. Remember, ischemic heart disease is #1 public enemy. Here you just see all of the symptoms that patients will have with heart failure. They will be dyspneic, that is, they'll be short of breath. You will find maybe their lips are blue because they're not pumping enough oxygenated blood around. There may be heartburns, as we had in the patient in the last lecture with aortic stenosis. Sometimes on physical exam, you will hear a loud extra heart sound that says the ventricle's really hurting, the patient's breathing fast. You may hear actually sounds from fluid in the lungs and so forth. There's a whole variety of physical findings that the doctor finds that confirms the diagnosis of heart failure. Remember from the last lecture, the most important thing are the symptoms. They give you the clue. 90% of the answer of the diagnosis is in the history. You then move to the physical exam. Oh yes, I'm hearing things, I'm seeing things that suggest that the reason the patient is tired, the reason the patient is short of breath, the reason the patient has swelling in their legs is because of heart failure. Right ventricular heart failure alone can cause a different set of symptoms and signs. Of course, the edema, the extra fluid, is in the legs. And you will remember that you may have problems in the abdomen because the increased venous pressure backing up is not only in the legs, but it's also in the abdomen. The liver swells. There's also swelling in fluid in the abdomen. Patients may find their waist size gaining. They become very, very tired. And often you can even feel on physical exam this bulging abdomen that's full of fluid. Remember again, right heart failure, much less common than left heart failure. Commonest cause of left heart failure, ischemic heart disease, that is previous heart attack. So here's a few diagrams that just show you what the cardiologist sees when they see a patient, usually with very clear and significant heart failure. And you can see that their pupils may be dilated from the adrenaline that's circulating. The skin may be gray or pale or even blue, cyanotic. And a whole bunch of things. They may be short of breath, breathing fast. They may be uncomfortable lying back and feel more comfortable breathing sitting up. There may actually be sounds in the lungs from fluid in the lungs, crackles or so-called growls. They may have a cough from the excess fluid that's in their system. There is often increased pressure in the veins, and you can actually see that in the neck. I'm going to show you a picture of that. And the blood pressure may be decreased because the cardiac output is down. And also, the patient may even have some discomfort in the abdomen, swelling and nausea and so forth. And of course, you may see bulging of the abdomen, as I mentioned, and edema that is swelling in the legs. All of these are not seen necessarily in one patient, but in individuals you may see a number of these findings. And of course, patients' anxiety level is increased, of course, because they're short of breath. One of the worst things that can happen to you is to be suffocated. It activates anxiety in a huge way. And again, you may see the fact that the patient has decreased oxygen saturation. Often we can test that with a little finger thing or an ear thing to see that the oxygen level in the blood is going down. The patients in advanced heart failure may be confused, particularly in elderly patients. There may be, as I'm going to show you a picture in a moment, the jugular vein is distended because of high film pressures in the right atrium transmitted back to the jugular vein. There can, if the patient's had a heart attack, there may be chest discomfort in association with this. Of course, the patient is markedly fatigued, and you may hear the heart sounds that I mentioned before, this extra heart sound. The heart may be increased in rate. And again, you may feel swelling of the liver or the spleen from the venous congestion that goes back there. And of course, there's decreased cardiac output if you measure that, often with an echo, and the pulse may be therefore weak. The patient is often cool. The skin may be sweaty. So here's a picture. There's a lovely picture of distended jugular vein. You can see it rising up from just above the clavicle, the bone that's right here in the front of the chest, and you can see rising up almost to the level of the jaw. So this is a patient with quite advanced heart failure. In this case, it's a finding of right ventricular failure, but the commonest cause of right ventricular failure is often left ventricular failure that increases pressure in the lungs, increases the work of the right ventricle, which eventually fails. So this could be a patient with left ventricular and right ventricular failure, or it could be somebody with isolated right ventricular failure. And here we see an example of peripheral edema. You can see you push into the soft tissue of the leg, and you'll notice that the impression stays when you take your finger away. So this is a patient with advanced peripheral edema. It also looks to me like the skin doesn't have its normal tone, its normal color. It looks gray and mottled, and often this is because of decreased cardiac output.
¿Cuál de las siguientes es la causa más común de insuficiencia cardíaca? Estamos todos de acuerdo que la enfermedad isquémica, ¿verdad? Eso ya lo hemos hablado varias veces. O sea, todas son causas,
Claro,
pero la más común
5%.
es enfermedad isquémica, ¿no? Y entonces, por eso es importante cuando lean preguntas en el examen, o sea, siempre pilas, porque a veces se puede preguntar algo, cuál es la causa, y por ahí, por andar hecha la loquita, leen rápido y no leen que está diciendo cuál es la más común, ¿ya? O cuál es el mejor tratamiento, cuál es el mejor siguiente paso en este paciente. No quiere decir que todas las otras están equivocadas, pero te está dando cuál de todas las que sí se pueden hacer, cuál es la primera que deberías hacer o cuál es el mejor de todos, ¿no? Ojo con este tipo de preguntas. ¿Cuál de los siguientes es menos probable que se observe en un paciente con insuficiencia cardíaca? Disminución de la producción de orina, apetito incrementado, soplos cardíacos, cianosis y disnea.
Ah, menos probable.
¿Estamos todos claros que apetito? ¿Por qué? A ver, que quiero ver que haya un razonamiento de médico, no no de delincuente, ¿cómo se llama? ¿Cómo se llama los delincuentes? Los ojos, tiguerones. ¿Tú eres tiguerón? Recuerda como médico, a ver, quien sea.
Los tigrecitos.
Se puede presentar congestión hepática, y eso a su vez no sé, puede hacer que el paciente sienta sensación de llenura.
¿Alguien que tiene otra teoría?
Mi teoría, la verdad, doctor, es por descarte, porque los pacientes, por ejemplo, en insuficiencia cardíaca sí presentan una disminución de la orina por la recepción de líquido. En el caso de soplos cardíacos sí se escucha. Cianosis por la misma congestión, por una fila de líquido también. Entonces, por descarte me queda...
Bueno, a ver, no está mal que lo hagas por descarte, sino que ahora tengo que descartar. Pero quiero alguien que me razone como médico, me diga por qué hay pérdida de apetito.
Porque si un paciente con insuficiencia puede presentar disnea, a la hora de comer no va a comer porque
Se atora, ¿no?
se ahoga.
¿Ah?
Y esa sensación de ahogo no deja que el paciente coma.
Se le va la mano.
Se le va la mano.
Se desespera.
Okay. ¿Alguien más que me podría? Razonamiento clínico. Razonamiento clínico, vamos. Esa respuesta no está en WhatsApp. Ah. Busque por el chat GPT a ver si hay una respuesta. Yo sé que les encanta ChatGPT. Ajá. Oh, chica, pero no hay intervención. Macías está más ruco que Schumacher.
Yo digo que por el hecho de que la insuficiencia cardíaca no tiene ninguna correlación con el sistema digestivo. Pienso yo, o sea, no debería porque
Podría ser por el mismo bajo gasto cardíaco, el paciente está débil, anémico, no tiene ganas de comer y a la vez también le da caquexia, anorexia.
Para decepción.
No saben, entonces, por ende, ustedes no saben fisiología.
Es que no.
A ver, ¿qué pasa cuando tengo hipoperfusión? ¿Qué pasa con los receptores? ¿Aumenta qué cosa? aumenta la actividad simpática. Okay. ¿Qué acción tiene la actividad simpática sobre el tubo digestivo? Si parasimpático era en el estado de descanso y digestión, disminuye, en cambio simpático, disminuye la motilidad gástrica, disminuye la secreción de ácido clorhídrico y otras sustancias más, disminuye la secreción de grelina. ¿Qué es la grelina? La grelina, claro, la saciedad. ¿Ya? O sea, el aumento de grelina, la hambre y la disminución, la saciedad, ¿verdad? Entonces, si el sistema activado del simpático, todo eso está apagado o disminuido, ¿ok? En su acción. Por ende, no da hambre, pues, ¿ok? Por eso que el que se mete anfetaminas no come, se ponen flaquitos. ¿Ah? ¿Cuándo han visto? Bueno, los hay, pero por lo general el estereotipo de que se meta anfetaminas o del cocainómano son así como el libro. ¿Ya? ¿Ok? ¿Ok? ¿Por qué? Porque no comen, les quitan, no tienen hambre porque tienen muy activado el sistema simpático. O sea, ese es el razonamiento de un médico. No porque me estoy ahogando y me estoy ahogando no quiero comer. No, pues eso lo dice cualquiera. ¿Cuál de los siguientes es más probable que en un paciente con insuficiencia cardíaca del lado derecho? Estenosis aórtica, presión de pulso estrecha, hinchazón bilateral de la pierna, latido del ápice agrandado, edema pulmonar del lado derecho. Hinchazón. ¿Cuál de los siguientes es menos probable que se observe un proceso de insuficiencia cardíaca? Presión arterial disminuida, colapso de la vena yugular, ascitis, congestión pulmonar, anorexia. Menos probable, ¿verdad? Colapso de la vena yugular. Colapso de la vena yugular, ¿no? Porque la vena se izquierda. Porque debería estar distorsionada. Yo lo veo que están todos como locos que se quieren ir, bueno, no sé, yo llegué 30 minutos tarde porque estaba en una reunión abajo. No sé, que tenía otra clase ahorita.
We're going to do some tests to confirm.
¿Ah? Bueno, váyanse. O sea, yo quiero enseñarles, o sea, pero si no quieren aprender, bueno, vayan. Para mí mejor, porque yo ya termino y me voy a mi casa a almorzar. Si nos quedamos hasta ahí, listo. Estudien que me lo voy a fajar en el examen. Y ahí los quiero ver reírse así, ¿ok? Ya ahora pues se acabó la clase. Si me decían no, doctor, denos más tiempo, yo me quedaba, pero no quiero. Vayan a jugar a la espadita. ¿Ah? que, a ver, si a veces tiene que ir, si puede ir, o sea, ya nadie se detiene. Esto es, todos supongo que estamos aquí porque queremos ser médicos un día, ¿verdad? ¿Cuántos de ustedes? A mí me da igual. A mí mejor. Un profesor mío decía, cada quien puede hacer en su culo un florero. Bueno, entonces, avancemos un poquito más, ¿ok?
Heart clinical impressions. Have the history. Oh, this suggests heart failure. The patient short of breath. They have peripheral edema. Oh, we listen. So, of course, we're going to do some tests to confirm our clinical impression. You have the history. Oh, this suggests heart failure. The patient short of breath. They have peripheral edema. Oh, we listen to the heart and we hear an extra sound, like S3 gallop. Okay, we now pretty sure the patient has heart failure. Then we do a chest x-ray. You can see the two examples here. The one on the one side is normal and the one on the other side shows an enlarged heart. Sometimes we will even see evidence of fluid in the lungs. Pretty obvious on this chest x-ray. This is called pulmonary edema. The left ventricle has failed significantly, and what we see is fluid throughout the lungs. And of course, this patient is very short of breath. They might be breathing at 30 or 40 times a minute. Normal is about 12, 13, 14 times a minute. And you may actually hear gurgling from this fluid that's collecting in the small alveolar sacs in the lung and being transmitted into the bigger bronchial tubes. This can drop the oxygen saturation in the blood, can lead to fatal arrhythmias, and people can die from this. And this is a medical emergency that requires urgent therapy. And here is a chest x-ray showing a variety of findings of a little less serious heart failure. One can see edema in the lymphatics, so-called curly lines. One can see fluid collecting in the pleura. You can see in the little angle there where the heart meets the chest, there's a little sort of rounded area. That's actually fluid in the pleural space, the space that surrounds the lungs. There's a variety of other findings that the radiologist will often call you up and say, your patient has heart failure. We often do an echocardiogram to see how bad of the heart failure is. For example, is it left ventricular? Is it right ventricular? Is it very advanced? Is the ejection fraction, that is the percentage of blood squeezed out by the heart, very low? Or is it only modestly reduced? This is an echocardiogram from a patient with very advanced heart failure. The left ventricle is markedly dilated. We don't see the film with it, but I'm sure if we saw the film, instead of the ventricle squeezing normally like this, it's doing this. Hardly squeezing at all. And you can see also in this echo, the left ventricle is enlarged. So this is a patient with long-standing heart failure. So let's talk a little bit about treatment. Clearly, treatment goals are to reduce the edema, to reduce the excess fluid volume, and to make the patient much more comfortable and able to have full activity. You'd also like to increase the pumping ability of the heart. Sometimes, if it's, for example, in the patient we talked about in the last lecture, somebody with aortic stenosis, taking away the stenotic valve and putting in a good valve allows the ventricle to recover. In other settings, if it's due to severe ischemia, lack of blood flow in the heart, coronary bypass or angioplasty may improve the blood flow in the heart and may, not always, but may improve the function of the ventricle and again lead to resolution of symptoms. And there's a variety of drugs that help increase the removal of fluid from the body. For example, diuretics that increase renal excretion of water and salt will reduce the excess volume of salt and water in the body and often lead to marked improvement in the symptoms. Patients with heart failure, particularly new heart failure, require hospitalization. They require a number of tests to determine why they have heart failure, and they also require a number of drugs that are used to improve, if possible, the function of the heart and to decrease the work of the heart and to increase fluid and salt excretion. And what you do, this step diagram is a complicated one. I'm not anticipating that anybody needs to learn this right away, but it shows you as the heart failure increases, the aggressiveness of our therapy increases. So in the beginning, we use ACE inhibitors, that is, they vasodilate the arterioles, they decrease the blood pressure a bit, and they decrease the work of the heart. In a sense, what we're trying to do is rest the heart, make the heart's job, the left ventricle's job, a little easier. But as you go along, there's a variety of other interventions that are used, both improving blood flow, for example, with angioplasty. We also use drugs that rest the heart a little bit by decreasing the heart rate, beta blockers, and then eventually you may even progress to devices that increase the pumping ability of the heart while you're getting ready to do something more aggressive, for example, change a heart valve, or even in the most severe stages, do a heart transplant, give the patient a new heart. It's important that patients have lifestyle changes, particularly with the milder forms of heart failure, because what we're trying to do is prevent heart failure from progressing. So what are those lifestyle changes? Clearly, somebody who's obese, you've got a lot of extra weight around. If you have a big belly that has 40 or 50 pounds of extra weight, it's like you're carrying a 40 or 50 pound knapsack on your back and you're asking the heart to do that extra work. You can imagine that's a bad idea. So dieting and reduction of obesity is important. Number two, cutting back on salt. Because the more salt you take in, the compensatory mechanisms of the body hold on to that salt and, of course, increase blood volume. So restriction of salt. It turns out that regular, particularly in the beginning, supervised exercise or physical activity actually improve the whole cardiovascular system and enable patients to do more work with the same cardiac output that they had before. And of course, stopping things like cigarette smoking, which are damaging to the blood vessels and which can cause acceleration of atherosclerosis, just as we talked about in patients with a heart attack or coronary artery disease. There's a whole variety of lifestyle changes, and often these are integrated between the cardiologist and a good cardiac rehabilitation program.
Medication management is tailored to the type of heart failure that a patient has, whether they have heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, as we already heard, called HFpEF, or whether the heart failure patient has a reduced ejection fraction, so-called HFrEF. And of course, medication management is tailored to the patient's symptoms and signs. If a patient has volume overload with dyspnea or peripheral edema, of course, they need diuresis, usually with a loop diuretic to remove excess fluid. For patients with a compelling indication for a specific type of antihypertensive medication, for example, if a patient has diabetes or chronic kidney disease, then an ACE inhibitor or an angiotensin receptor blocker should be used before starting HFpEF specific therapies, such as mineralocorticoid blockers or SGLT2 inhibitors. Of course, you have to look carefully at the patient's renal function. If it is quite impaired, then ACE inhibitors or ARBs are contraindicated because they might make the renal failure worse. For patients without diabetes, then, heart failure-specific medications are indicated. The next step is to add a sodium glucose co-transporter 2 inhibitor, SGLT2 inhibitor. I like to call them Flozins because that's part of their generic name. Or, of course, and/or mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists. SGLT2 inhibitors are medications like empagliflozin or dapagliflozin. You notice the term flozin in the middle of those terms. A mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, or MRA as it's often known, such as spironolactone or Clarinone, can be added. If the patient has a systolic blood pressure below 100 or symptoms of hypotension such as dizziness or other orthostatic symptoms, then other antihypertensive drugs should be decreased or discontinued, otherwise you're liable to have severe symptomatic hypotension. The primary therapies for heart failure with reduced ejection fraction are ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers called ARBs, or the combination medication of an angiotensin receptor blocker and a neprilysin inhibitor put together are called ANRIs, and the neprilysin inhibitor is known as sacubitril, and it's a blocker of the breakdown enzymes for atrial peptides. Thus, the ANRI drug is a double vasodilator. And again, you have to be careful about the blood pressure. Beta blockers should be added if there are no contraindications, and the specific 3 that have been demonstrated to benefit patients with heart failure are carvedilol, bisoprolol, and extended-release metoprolol succinate. If patients have contraindications to any of the renin-angiotensin system's antagonists,
ojo con esto, porque si se llegasen a encontrar con una pregunta de que está preguntando qué beta bloqueante reduce la mortalidad, ¿ok? Y si que les pongo atenolol, les pongo timolol, propanolol y por ahí solamente le pongo bisoprolol, la respuesta sería bisoprolol. Todos los demás son beta bloqueantes, sí, se los puede utilizar, pero no está comprobado que esos están, o sea, estudiados que realmente reducen la mortalidad. Los que reducen la mortalidad, aseguradísimo yo porque lo han estudiado, son estos acá. Carvedilol, bisoprolol y metoprolol. ¿Okay?
An alternative is hyperalazine long-acting nitrate. A typical contraindication to the renin-angiotensin system antagonist is advanced renal failure, because these drugs could increase the level of renal
Y
insufficiency.
otra cosa también que también se me hace pregunta, la hidralazina cuando se da junto con nitratos baja la mortalidad. Individualmente no, cuando se dan las dos juntas.
In patients who still have symptomatic heart failure, secondary therapies may be added in addition to the initial medications. And there's considerable current debate about the order that we give these drugs, which one should be first, which one second, and that is the subject of current ongoing heart failure research. These include the additional drugs that could be used. For example, mineralocorticoid receptor blockers, as we've already said, spironolactone and eplerenone, or the SGLT2 inhibitors, again, that were just mentioned. In certain symptomatic patients, we may need to consider cardiac resynchronization therapy done with a special form of pacemaker that also stimulates the left ventricle as well as the right ventricle, or transcatheter mitral valve repair, for example, clipping a loose mitral leaflet that's allowing for severe mitral regurgitation. You clip that to another leaflet and thereby decrease the amount of mitral regurg. Further secondary therapies, newer medications, include Versaclot or Ivabradine. So Versaclot is indicated for patients with New York Heart Association Class 2 to 4 heart failure with an ejection fraction less than 45%, who were either hospitalized in the last 6 months or require outpatient IV diuretics. Ivabradine is a very interesting new class of medication called hyperpolarization-activated cyclic nucleotide-gated channel blockers. What they do is they actually decrease the rate at which the sodium channel leaks in sinus node cells, and that results in a slowing of the heart rate. It's indicated for patients with an ejection fraction of 35% or less who are in sinus rhythm with a resting heart rate that's at least 70 beats per minute. And despite the beta blockers, or in beta blockers are either contraindicated or cause problems, then you can substitute the slowing drug using Ivabradine. Digoxin can be added to patients with end-stage heart failure who are not doing well despite optimal other pharmacologic therapies, as well as cardiac resynchronization therapy. Lastly, mechanical circulatory support devices such as left ventricular bypass pumps and intra-aortic balloons and even cardiac transplantation may be considered in some highly selected patients with refractory heart failure.
And again, there's patient counseling. We already talked about the lifestyle. Alcohol is a depressant on the heart, so we want patients drinking as little as possible. Smoking has to stop. We want weight control. We want regular exercise. All of the lifestyle things, again, repeated, to work with the medicines that we're giving or to work with the interventions, for example, opening up a coronary artery or replacing a heart valve. And further patient counseling, of course, involves the medications. Are the patients taking the medications, and are they taking them regularly and as appropriately prescribed? This is a huge problem. In the United States, many patients fail to take their medications. If there are surgical or catheter interventions, what these contain and what they can do and what the potential complications are. One wants to reduce stress in the patient's life. One wants the patient to keep track of symptoms. Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Is their weight gaining all of a sudden because of a marked increase in fluid retention? And of course, we would like patients to not overindulge in fluid intake and certainly come for follow-up visits with the doctor or the nurse clinician in order for us to monitor how things are going with therapy and if we have to make further adjustments in therapy. So, in conclusion, heart failure is a growth industry, particularly in older individuals. It's caused by many diseases, but in particular by atherosclerotic heart disease that causes damage to the left ventricle. Again, left ventricular systolic heart failure is the commonest. The left ventricle doesn't squeeze as well, and the commonest cause of that is ischemic heart disease. Prevention, of course, is better than cure. I don't have to tell you that. And how do we prevent that? By controlling atherosclerotic risk factors before they put the patient in the heart failure situation. Of course, there's a whole variety of diagnostic tests that we use when the patient presents with heart failure. But remember, the clue is in the patient's symptoms with confirmation by the exam, and then we do some sophisticated tests to see what's the cause of the heart failure and how severe is the ventricular damage. And then we introduce a whole variety of therapies, both drugs and even some of the newer device therapies. For example, we can open up blood vessels, and even in extreme cases, we can take over with little pumps for the heart while we're trying to get it to respond and come back to normal. And of course, then we're going to have to do lifestyle changes. There's a new pacing protocol with a special pacemaker that can, in some selected patients, can improve the pumping of the heart. All of these are fairly extreme things done right at the end. And again, we talked about the fact that there's a lot of technology here, but the best deal is to stop the heart failure before it starts with reduction in risk factors, or identifying it early and getting all of those things, including the lifestyle changes, implemented before the patient progresses to a point that they need things like biventricular pacing and heart-lung machines and so forth. Thank you for listening to this lecture. I look forward to seeing you with the next one.
¿Cuál de los siguientes estudios es más apropiado que el diagnóstico inicial de edema pulmonar en un paciente con insuficiencia ventricular izquierda? Conocida. Ecocardiograma, radiografía del pecho, presión central,
Radiografía de pecho.
¿Cuál dijeron? No entendí nada.
Radiografía de pecho.
Radiografía del pecho.
O ecocardiografía, no sé. Eco. No. Es que es radiografía.
¿Segurísimo?
Segurísimo.
¿Segurísimo por allá?
¿Qué cosa? ¿Cuál lo pones? ¿Eco o radiografía?
Radiografía.
Dime tú qué quieres poner.
Radiografía.
La verdad.
Radiografía.
Ajá.
Acá hay una radiografía. ¿Por qué?
Porque ahí uno puede evidenciar la
Eso puede
sincronización,
haber en
que es
los
la congestión, puede ser la idea de
Yo estoy de acuerdo con la radiografía. Es más económico, es rápido, es sencillo. Aparte, ya sabes que tiene insuficiencia cardíaca. ¿Ya? Porque la nota dice, o sea, está diciendo diagnóstico inicial. O sea, no quiere decir que no le vas a hacer un eco, pero probablemente antes le vas a hacer una radiografía. ¿Qué fármaco no se utiliza habitualmente en el tratamiento de insuficiencia cardíaca? ¿Por qué? ¿Cuál?
Benzatina también.
¿Qué hace? ¿Cuáles son los efectos secundarios del glucocorticoide? Anales, ¿qué? Anales. Los glucocorticoides que pueden provocar.
O sea, por el uso prolongado o el Cushing.
Ok, se llama el Cushing, ¿qué características tiene? ¿Cómo qué cosa? ¿Por qué?
¿Qué son los glucocorticoides?
Voy a hablar de PPS en la primera año. Un glucocorticoide puede aumentar la presión arterial, ¿verdad? Sí. Pueden promover también que mantenga un poco de líquido también, ¿verdad? O sea, son todas cosas que pueden descompensar más a un paciente con insuficiencia cardíaca. Entonces sí, el glucocorticoide no lo va a usar por eso. O sea, son una bala para decir respuesta, pero no tienen la menor idea de cuál es el mecanismo detrás de eso. Ok, el recurso del descarte lo usa ya en el examen y antes que va, la tiene que jugar. Pero en la clase trata de razonar. ¿Okay? ¿Cuál de los siguientes no se considera un sistema neurohormonal compensador de insuficiencia cardíaca? Sistema renina-aldosterona, sistema nervioso simpático, sistema nervioso parasimpático, sustancias vasoactivas, hormona antidiurética. Parasimpático, ¿no? Estaba fácil.
Parasimpático.
Estoy chequeando. ¿Cuál de los siguientes no forma parte de la terapia de combinación inicial para pacientes con insuficiencia cardíaca con una fracción de eyección reducida?
La clonidina.
Porque es un simpático lítico de acción central. Y eso yo.
Y ese yo no sé.
Ah,
De todas maneras la clonidina.
Se puede alfa, agonista principal.
Siento mucha duda con esa respuesta.
No es clonidina, es simpático lítico.
Con la clonidina, porque es simpático lítico, pero dice, no forma parte de la terapia de combinación inicial. Entonces, al darle un simpático lítico, ¿qué estás haciendo con la insuficiencia cardíaca?
hipertensión de rebota.
Hipertensión, rebote,
Sedación,
taquicardia,
taquicardia, cefalea.
todo eso como efecto.
¿Y sobre qué receptores alfa trabajan? ¿Qué están unidos a qué tipo de proteína? Punto G por ahí. ¿Ah?
Ese ahí se puede ir. Si estás seguro, pues.
Si es un simpático líquido, ¿cómo hacer un GS?
No puede decir ese sin un simpático lítico.
Corina, ¿verdad?
Lo que Diosito quiere. Ojalá que así sea la pregunta.
¿Cuál de los tratamientos médicos dados se utiliza como agente de segunda línea en la insuficiencia cardíaca?
Ese es de segunda línea, como la diagnosis. Todos los demás son de primera línea y los hipotrópicos son de segunda línea. Ejemplo, digoxina.
¿Y dice la demás?
Digoxina es segunda línea.
Entonces, ¿cuál sería la respuesta?
Hipotrópico positivo.
Puede ser sí, ¿no? Porque no, todos los demás suelen ser en primera línea. El neurotrópico lo utiliza ya cuando no termina de responder. Porque pues, los neurotrópicos aumentan o disminuyen la mortalidad.
Aumenta la mortalidad.
Aumenta la mortalidad del neurotrópico. ¿Ah? O disminuye la mortalidad.
Yo escuché a alguien decir
Si no se lo usa,
¿Ah?
si no se lo usa en primera línea.
Es un punto ahí, ok, ya. Pero ¿por qué? ¿Por qué? Entonces me dicen que un neurotrópico aumenta la mortalidad. ¿Por qué? Porque aumenta la demanda de oxígeno. ¿Okay? Un corazón que está sufriendo, que se está ahogando, ¿okay? Encima le está cortando más oxígeno, o sea, le está haciendo que requiera más oxígeno. Es como alguien que se va a bucear y ya le queda poquito oxígeno en el tanque, y encima agarra y le hace un nudo al, qué sé yo, al tubo que le lleva oxígeno. Lo aumenta la mortalidad, ¿verdad? Ya me cansé también yo.